The wind spoke first, not in words, not in warnings, but in the way it whistled across the desolate highlands, low, steady, eternal. It seeped into your bones before you could name the ache. It tore at cloaks, nipped at fingers, and hissed through the narrow stone gaps of crofter huts where sleep was thin and never warm. In medieval Scotland, before kingdoms rose and fell with parchment and ink, there was the cold. It was more than a season. It was a presence, a gatekeeper, a silent judge. No one was born in the Highlands expecting warmth. A child took their first breath wrapped in scratchy wool, next to a hearth that crackled but rarely comforted. The fire was fed not just by wood, but by labour. Someone had to cut that fuel, often a woman, hunched against the wind, fingers red and split, dragging bundles back to a smoke-choked hut. The Highland air had a way of distorting time. Months felt like years when all you could hear was the constant rustle of grass and crows above the bogs. Many days were spent not living, but enduring, one muddy step at a time, and yet they stayed. Why? Because leaving wasn't much better. The lowlands offered little to those without land, without title. Cities were strange and far, forests thick with wolves and whispers. At least in the Highlands a man could die on land that hated him, but it was his land, or so he believed. You had to rise early, not because of a rooster's crow or church bell, but because the cold would wake you before anything else. You couldn't ignore it. It was the kind of cold that stole breath, that burned, before it numbed, and then the work began. There were fields to dig, thin earth with stones sharp as broken teeth. Crops rarely took. Barley and oats struggled to thrive under cloudy skies. Hunger was constant. The stomach's ache was like a familiar lullaby, a background hum to every task. What you did grow, you guarded, not just from the elements, from neighbours. Even kindred clans were bound by blood, yes, but blood spilled easily when survival was involved. A missing sack of grain could mean a dead child. Trust was a luxury few could afford. And then there were the animals. They were more valuable than gold, yet just as vulnerable. Cattle were locked inside huts at night, not out of affection, but because they were warm bodies and tempting targets. It was a strange kind of coexistence. Man and beast sleeping shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same foul air, exchanging. Fleas in the darkness. Disease was always near. A cough could turn into death by morning. With no medicine but prayer and bitter herbs, the sick were often left to the mercy of nature, and nature had none. Worse still was childbirth. Every birth was a gamble. Midwives whispered incantations under their breath while wiping blood from stone floors. A newborn's cry was celebrated not with joy, but with relief. Relief that the mother still breathed. Relief that the baby wasn't marked by something strange. Because strange things happened in the Highlands. Stories passed from mouth to ear in the long nights. About figures seen on ridgelines. About lights flickering on the moor after sunset. About voices that mimicked the living, but spoke to no one. Superstition was a language everyone understood, even if no one admitted it aloud. You didn't speak the name of things you feared. You simply obeyed their rules. Never whistle in the dark. Never turn your back on the sea. Never bring iron near the stones that stood alone in the field. Were these just tales? Perhaps. But in a land this harsh, belief was another form of protection. The church was far, sometimes in distance, often in relevance. Faith came in two forms: the whispered Latin of a priest who came once every few months, and the ancient beliefs, older than Rome, spoken in hushed tones by grandmothers with salt in their pockets. The cold didn't care which you followed. It took believers and skeptics just the same. There were, of course, rare days when the sun split, the sky. On those days, the heather glowed, rivers shimmered, children laughed louder, but they were short. The winter always returned, and with it, the cold silence. Not a peaceful silence, not the kind found in sleep or prayer. This was a silence that reminded you were alone. that no matter how close the fire, how strong the clan, how loud the songs sung over barley ale, there was something older watching, waiting. The Highlands did not forgive, but neither did they forget, and every stone, every stream, every howling wind carried the memory of those who had once stood defiant and froze where they stood. The name on your lips could be a weapon. In medieval Scotland, your clan name was more than identity. It was allegiance, history, promise, and curse. The moment you were born, your future had already chosen sides. From the rolling heather fields of Argyll to the shadowed glens of Caithness, Scotland was not a united people. It was a mosaic of bloodlines, stitched together by ancient grudges and newer wounds. Clans didn't just feud, they remembered, and they never forgot. Imagine being a boy, no more than 10, standing beside your father as he muttered names over a fire. Not prayers, not stories, but lists of those your family had lost. Your uncle, slain near the river crossing. Your cousin, dragged from a croft and left for the crows, all killed by men bearing another name. You were not taught forgiveness. You were taught the weight of memory. Clans were like living creatures, breathing, brooding, bleeding. They thrived on loyalty and suspicion in equal measure. A smile could hide a dagger. A handshake could begin a war. The feuds often started with cattle, or land, or insults passed after too much drink, but they always ended the same way: blood in the grass and silence in the home. Once the killing began, it rarely stopped. For every death, there must be a reckoning. And when that reckoning came, it didn't matter if years had passed. If the man you hunted had grey in his beard or children of his own, vengeance, in the Highland code, aged like whiskey, stronger with time. Entire generations were raised under banners of revenge. In some glens, the cycle had lasted so long that no one remembered who had struck the first blow. It didn't matter. The feud had become a tradition, and woe to the child born into it. If you were of Clan MacDonald, you knew the name Campbell like the hiss of a blade. If you bore the name Keith, the guns were your shadow. Some names were spoken only in curses, others not at all. Clan loyalty wasn't just pride, it was survival. You wore your tartan like a shield. You carved the clan crest into stone above your hearth, and you knew never to travel alone. The roads were dangerous, not because of wolves, but because of men. Every hill, every pass, every forest had stories. This is where he was ambushed. That's where they found the widow with her throat slit. That stone? It's red, not from moss, but from blood. The government, what little there was, tried to contain the chaos. Edicts were issued from Edinburgh. Meetings were forced between warring clans. Sometimes the king himself would call for peace, but a royal seal on parchment meant little in the glens where justice was measured not in laws, but in balance. They called it blood for blood. If your brother was murdered, you had the right, no, the duty to avenge him. It was more than personal. It was expected. To ignore such an act was to shame your name, your ancestors, and your clan. You didn't weep. You sharpened your dirk. There were, of course, those who tired of the killing. Men who buried brothers and swore no more. But the world did not allow such softness. If you did not strike back, others would see it as weakness, and weakness was an invitation. The cycle of violence fed itself. Even weddings could be traps. There are records, half rumour, half truth, of weddings that turned into massacres. Feasts where guests were poisoned. Ceremonies where the groom never returned from the woods. Hospitality was sacred, but not always honoured. And in the worst betrayals, it was family that bled family. Blood feuds didn't just destroy enemies, they devoured homes. Cousins turned against cousins, manipulated by old grudges and whispered schemes. Sometimes a single spark, an unpaid dowry, a stolen sheep, was enough to set an entire village ablaze. But it wasn't all blind rage. No, there was something colder about it, a calculation. You'd ride out in the night, not with fire and chaos, but with silence, with discipline. A small group of men, faces painted, knives wrapped in cloth to stop their clatter. You knew where they slept. You knew how many guards. You knew who to kill and who to leave, to spread the fear. And when the deed was done, you didn't linger. You vanished into the mist, leaving only grief behind. The bards sang of battles and honor, but they rarely told of the mornings after. The widows, the crying children, the scorched homes, the smell of iron and smoke. That was the true face of the clan wars. But here's the cruelest truth. Despite all the blood, the fighting changed little. Borders didn't move. Kings didn't fall. The same hills stood silent. The same streams ran red, then clear again. The dead were buried, the names remembered, and the next revenge plotted. Sometimes there was peace. Fragile things, often arranged by marriage or shared enemies. But peace in the Highlands was like mist, thick at dawn, gone by midday. And in this landscape of grudges, one could never be truly safe. You might live your whole life without drawing a blade, but still die for the sins of your great-grandfather. In medieval Scotland, the feud was not just history, it was inheritance. And long after the swords were laid down, the names remained, etched into stone, into song, into memory. To the outsider, they seemed like fortresses of safety. Castles perched on cliffs, towering above the mist, symbols of strength and authority. But within those stone walls, life was rarely safe, and never free. Castles in medieval Scotland were not the romantic relics seen on postcards. They were prisons of power, built less for comfort and more for control. They rose from the earth like jagged teeth, made from local stone, weather-beaten and cold even in summer. Walls several feet thick, narrow windows that let in more wind than light, gates heavy enough to crush a man. No one walked easily through a castle. The moment you entered, the air changed. It smelled of damp wood, scorched tallow, mildew, and something older. Fear, perhaps, or the memory of it. Because behind those walls, anything could happen. A lord's rule was absolute. He decided who lived, who starved, who suffered. His word could condemn a man to the stocks, the noose, or worse, without trial, without question. But don't be fooled. Even the Lord was a prisoner. He lived under constant threat of betrayal, of rebellion, of war. That's why the halls were narrow and winding, easy to defend. That's why the stairs spiraled clockwise, to give right-handed defenders the advantage. That's why the walls echoed. So no secret conversation stayed secret for long. In many castles, the Great Hall was a stage for performance. Feasts of roasted meat and honeyed wine, musicians and jesters. But beneath the laughter was strategy. Who sat closest to the hearth? Who was kept far from the Lord's gaze? Every seat, every toast, every smile carried meaning. And in private chambers, that same Lord might whisper orders for a cousin to disappear, or for a visiting priest to be detained, or for his own wife to be watched closely. Trust was rare, poison more common than most believed. The kitchens, the beating heart of the castle, were never still and never silent. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to listen too closely, lest they be accused of eavesdropping. The penalty for a loose tongue? Often, no tongue at all. Even children learned to speak carefully, to watch before they played, to remember which guards were friendly and which were not. The dungeon, always below and always wet, was a place no one wanted to see. Some castles kept it hidden behind false walls. Others made it visible, to remind all who entered. Mercy is not owed here. Iron shackles, wooden stocks, rats large enough to steal bread from your lap. And torture wasn't rare, it was ritual. Some lords believed pain was a truth-teller. Others used it for spectacle. The rack, the thumbscrew, the cage hung from the walls where men were left to rot in public view. Screams became part of the landscape, like church bells, but darker. But even without cruelty, castle life was hard. Stone was unforgiving. In winter, it absorbed the cold and gave nothing back. Fires roared in hearths, but the warmth rarely reached, beyond a few feet. Blankets were rough, beds often crawling with lice. Water froze in jugs before it could be drunk. And above all, the silence. Thick, heavy silence, especially at night. Guards pacing above, whispers below, the occasional cry of an owl or something stranger. Some swore they heard footsteps in locked corridors. Others spoke of ghostly figures, former prisoners, betrayed lovers, children left behind. Superstition lived in the mortar. Not all who dwelled in castles were noble. Many were servants, soldiers, stable hands, cooks, maids. They worked from before, dawn to after dark. And they knew, displeasing the wrong man could cost them everything. There was no appeal, no justice. You might be flogged for breaking a plate, hanged for stealing a turnip, or simply vanish. Women in particular had little safety. Even noble women married into power found their lives confined, first to a chamber, then to childbirth, and too often to grief. A miscarriage could mean suspicion. A sick child, whispers of witchcraft. A barren wife, a curse. And if a woman spoke out of turn, she might be silenced forever. Even the architecture was meant to dominate. High towers to look down upon villagers, iron portcullises to crush hope, arrow slits, narrow, precise, reminders that mercy had no entry. To attack a castle was to invite death. Boiling oil, arrows, boulders, even dead animals hurled from catapults to spread disease. But to live in one was not much kinder. The people below, the farmers, the crofters, often envied the life above. But they didn't know the truth, that many in the castle would have traded their stone beds and gilded chains for freedom in the mud. Because at least, in the mud, no one watched your every move. No one waited to slit your throat while you slept. No one poisoned your wine. Castles were not homes. They were machines of power, and power in medieval Scotland came with a cost. So the next time you see a crumbling keep silhouetted against the heather sky, remember, its stones were set with sweat, with cruelty, and with fear, and they remember everything. A man did not need to wield a sword to commit treason in medieval Scotland. Sometimes all it took was a whisper. In a world where survival depended on loyalty, clan loyalty, royal loyalty, or loyalty to one's god, betrayal was not just a crime. It was a curse. One that followed a name for generations. And the punishment? It was never swift, never quiet. It was meant to echo. The Scottish Highlands and Lowlands both had long memories, but none so long as when betrayal had been uncovered. They could forgive theft. They might forgive a drunken brawl. But a man who betrayed his kin or his lord was worse than dead. He was erased. But before erasure, there was judgment, and judgment came in many forms. Let us begin with the traitor's march. He would be dragged, not walked, through the centre of the village or castle court, tied by wrists or neck to a cart, his skin lashed by reeds, then by rope, then by whips. A procession of shame, his neighbours spitting, his family often forced to watch. Children would throw stones, priests would look away. Then came the trial, if there was one. Most trials were theatre. The sentence was already decided. Evidence? Irrelevant. The word of a lord outweighed a man's pleas. And when the crime was betrayal, the punishment had to be seen, because betrayal was like rot. If left unchecked, it would spread. In the lowlands, a traitor might be hanged. Not in the quiet shadow of a tree, but in the town square, at dawn, when the mist still hugged the cobblestones. The rope tightened slow, the body left swinging until the birds took notice. But in the Highlands, things were crueler. Some were staked to the ground and left for the cold, others thrown into peat bogs, drowned not just by water, but by silence. No last words, no gravestones, just forgotten bones beneath forgotten earth. And then there were the exceptional cases, when a betrayal touched nobility, or shook alliances, or spilled the blood of a laird. More creative punishments were devised. One man had his tongue nailed to a tree for speaking secrets to the English. Another was locked in an iron cage atop the castle walls, exposed to wind, rain, and mocking eyes until death took him weeks later. The body, in these cases, was often left for display. A warning, hands cut off and nailed to doors. Heads placed on spikes, blackened, rotting, grinning at every passerby. Sometimes the organs were removed and sent to the betrayed clan as a grotesque peace offering. But physical suffering wasn't the only cost. Betrayal meant your family name burned. Your sons might be denied land, your daughters denied marriage, your home confiscated, your belongings seized, generations punished for the sins of one man. And there were deeper betrayals, ones not seen by kings or clans, only by the heart. The betrayal of a brother selling secrets for silver, a friend who led you into an ambush, a wife who passed your letters to another man. These wounds didn't leave scars on skin. They left silence at the hearth, empty chairs, eyes that never looked the same again. Sometimes the traitor wasn't even caught, but the suspicion alone was poison. In small villages, rumors spread like wildfire. You didn't need proof, only doubt. A glance held too long, a visit unannounced, a question asked one too many times, and just like that, a man could be branded guilty. Some took their own lives before the rope could find them. Others fled, into the forests, the mountains, across the sea. But Scotland had a way of remembering. Even those who escaped judgment rarely escaped the shadow, because in medieval Scotland, honour was heavier than gold, and betrayal weighed more than sin. Even in the church, betrayal was met with holy fury. Monks who defied their abbot, who revealed sacred texts or challenged doctrine, were excommunicated, and sometimes worse. Some were buried face down. Others confined in isolation so complete they forgot the sound of another human voice. The idea was simple. A traitor did not deserve to be heard. Not in this life, not in the next. Yet, ironically, betrayal often began with hope, a promise whispered in the dark. If you tell me where they meet, I'll spare your brother. Or, switch, allegiance and your farm will double. The lure of survival, of gain, of revenge, it was powerful. But the gain never lasted. The man who betrayed often found himself betrayed in turn. A spy is useful only until they speak. Then they become dangerous. Many who conspired were later silenced by the very hands they fed. And even if they lived, they never truly did. They became shadows, pariahs, walked with their heads low, their backs watched. The kind of men who flinched at every knock, every footstep behind them, because they knew someone always remembered. Perhaps the cruelest part of all was this. Sometimes the traitor was right. They uncovered truths. They exposed corruption. They saw danger and chose to speak, but the truth did not matter, only loyalty did. So they were treated the same, as rats, as cowards, as broken men who spat on their own name, and when they screamed at the gallows, "I did it to protect you," no one listened. The crowd wanted blood, not explanations, and blood was always given. So if you had secrets, you buried them deep. If you saw injustice, you closed your eyes. If you felt doubt, you swallowed it whole. Because to speak, to stray, to step outside the line, was to risk the most feared label of all, traitor. And in medieval Scotland, that word alone could kill you. They said she whispered to crows, that she walked barefoot through frost and never shivered, that the smoke from her chimney curled the wrong way, and that milk curdled when she passed by. They called her a witch, and in medieval Scotland, that word was a death sentence. The moors were wide and bleak, open fields of heather and moss that stretched far from the eyes of the church, where fog rolled like spirits and the wind carried strange sounds. They were places of mystery, feared, avoided, and whispered about after dark. They were also the final refuge of the women who were no longer welcome elsewhere. Not all were witches. Many were simply different. Widows, midwives, healers, women who lived alone, women who spoke when they should have stayed silent, women who didn't kneel fast enough when the priest passed by. All it took was suspicion, and suspicion in a frightened village was as sharp as any blade. If a child fell ill after playing near a certain croft, if a man's cow gave no milk, if a storm ruined the barley, someone had to be blamed. They would remember the woman who muttered as she walked, who gathered herbs at dusk, who had no husband, and the whispers would begin. She cursed my sheep, one might say. She looked me in the eyes and I dreamed of fire, said another. The tales grew teeth, and soon a name became an accusation. In some places, the church came first. A man in robes, with ink-stained hands and a cold stare. He would ask questions, but never to the accused. He would question neighbours, relatives, children, piecing together fear into a case. And then the trial began. But it wasn't a trial. Not truly. It was a performance. A public burning before the fire was even lit. The accused was brought before the kirk, forced to kneel, asked impossible questions. Did you lie with the devil? Did you ride through the air at night? Did your shadow walk without you? If she denied it, they said she was cunning. If she wept, they said it was guilt. If she remained silent, they claimed it was because she had no soul left. Then came the tests. In one, they tied her thumbs to her toes and dropped her into water. If she floated, she was guilty, rejected by nature. If she sank, she was innocent. But most who sank did not rise again. Another test involved searching for the witch's mark, a spot on the body that felt no pain, usually a mole, or a scar, or even a freckle. They would poke with long needles over and over until blood stained the floor and someone cried out that the devil's sign had been found. Once condemned, the punishment varied. In the Highlands, she might be stoned. In the lowlands, burned. And sometimes, they didn't wait for formalities. A mob with torches could do what no court dared, dragging her from her hut, tying her to a post, flames licking her feet as her screams became ash on the wind. But what if some of them truly believed? What if, amid the fog and fear, there were women who knew things? Herbs that stopped bleeding, plants that soothed fever, whispers that calmed childbirth when the midwife had fled? They were called wise women once, until wisdom became dangerous. Because to know more than a man was to risk being called unnatural, and to live without needing a man was to risk being called cursed. So the women who knew stayed quiet. They buried their books, burned their notes, taught their daughters in secret. A bitter kind of inheritance, passed down not with pride, but with warnings. Never look them in the eyes. Never speak of the moon. Never let them see your hands, stained with root or blood. And still, the accusations came. Even men were not safe. In rare cases, a male healer or herbalist could be tried. But it was always worse for the women, because behind every accusation was control. Fear kept them silent. Fire kept them obedient. Even when the flames were gone, the fear remained. Children were taught to stay away from certain houses, to never take food from a woman alone, to cross themselves if they heard singing from the woods. And so, the moors became dotted with ruins, once homes, now blackened shells, markers of where suspicion had won. But here's the quiet truth most never admitted. The witches weren't the danger. The fear was. The fear that a woman might not need the church, that she might survive without a husband, that she might help others without permission, that she might understand life and death And when a society fears something it cannot control, it burns it. Centuries later, bones would be found beneath peat, charred timbers in places no maps remembered, charms carved into stone hidden deep inside forgotten walls, a twisted twig in the shape of a cross, signs of women who once were. The moors kept their secrets, the fog never told. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the heather stirs like breath, it feels like someone is still watching, waiting, not for revenge, not for justice, but to be remembered, not as witches, but as women. It was not war that killed the most in medieval Scotland. It was hunger. Not the kind that makes your stomach growl between meals, but the kind that carves your bones from the inside out. The kind that makes children stare blankly at walls, lips dry and cracked. The kind that silences villages. Hunger did not come like a storm. It came slowly, cautiously. It began with a late frost, a failed barley crop, too much rain, not enough sun, a cow that birthed still, or a hen that stopped laying, and then the pantry began to empty. You rationed the oats, you thinned the broth, you added water to milk until it was little more than a cloudy memory of cream, and still, it wasn't enough. The Highlands were especially cruel. Rocky soil, wind-scoured fields, short-growing seasons, peasants planted with hope and harvested with desperation. Every sprout mattered, every weed was a threat. In good years, you might have a handful of barley, a few root vegetables, dried fish, salted venison if you were lucky, or powerful. In bad years, you scraped the lichen from rocks and boiled grass until it turned your stomach. But the worst years had names, spoken in low tones, passed down in memory. The black year, the lean spring, the cold mouth, the winter without end. Those were the years when hunger stopped being a shadow and became a god, one that demanded offerings. You offered your livestock one by one, chickens first, then goats, then the old dog who'd guarded the door for 9 winters. Then, quietly, without words, you wondered if the cat would make broth. And still, hunger came. You offered pride, sold your daughter's woven shawl for a loaf of rye, bartered your wedding ring for half a sack of oats, gave your cloak to a traveller in exchange for salted meat you weren't sure was pig. And still, hunger stayed. When there was nothing left to trade, you offered dignity. You stole from your neighbour's field at night, dug into their ash pile to see if they'd discarded anything edible. Some chewed leather boots, softened with water and salt. Others ate moss or pine bark, or the bones from last year's feast, cracked open, boiled again. There are tales, unspoken in daylight, of worse things, of children going missing in the woods, of strangers found dead with bite marks not made by wolves, of mothers who rocked an empty cradle while licking marrow from the bones of things better left unnamed. Were these true, or were they the inventions of fear? It hardly mattered, because hunger made monsters of everyone. Even the church had little to give. Monasteries with their stores of grain often locked their doors. Priests preached of suffering as holy, a test of faith. But faith couldn't fill a stomach, and prayers did not grow potatoes. In the castles, lords hoarded what they had. Some gave nothing, others token amounts, to prevent rebellion, not out of mercy. There were exceptions, of course. Some clans shared what little they had. Some monasteries opened their cellars. Some men hunted for others, bringing back what meat could be found. But these were candles in a cave, flickering, faint. The roads became graveyards, not from battles, but from bodies. Men who left their crofts to seek food and never returned. Mothers who lay down in the snow beside their children, never rising. Travellers who were robbed not for coin, but for bread. When winter came, it was not a season, it was a sentence. And in spring, when the ice finally melted, the bodies thawed with it. Some survived. thin, silent, wary. Their skin stretched tight, their eyes too large for their faces. They did not speak of what they saw or what they ate, but you could see it in the way they looked at food, the way they counted each bite, the way they flinched when someone reached too quickly across the table. Hunger, once felt that deeply, never leaves you. It becomes part of you, passed, down like a scar, across generations. The stories that came after were never about glory or battle or kings. They were about the times when the earth gave nothing, when the wind mocked you, when the cows cried, when your own belly sounded like thunder in an empty sky. Children were warned, don't waste, don't throw food. You don't know the hunger. And they didn't, but their parents did, because the hunger had walked among them, sat at their table, slept beside them at night. It had taken more than war ever could, not just flesh, but hope. And the terrible truth was this: you could fight an enemy, you could flee a plague, but you could not run from hunger. It found you, always. And when it did, it changed you, forever. A king's crown may glitter, but its weight crushes more than just the man beneath it. In medieval Scotland, the king was not simply a ruler. He was warlord, judge, priest, executioner, and, at times, monster. To the poor, the king was a rumour, a name they swore oaths to, a face they never saw. His laws came like thunder from distant mountains, unreachable, deaf, and cold. He lived behind stone walls, guarded by men in iron and prayers sewn into silk. And when the king turned cruel, there was no recourse, only silence or rebellion. Both often ended the same way. Scotland's monarchs were forged in blood. Few wore the crown without spilling kin to get it. Brothers killed brothers, sons turned on fathers. Nobles smiled at coronations while sharpening blades beneath the table. Trust was not a requirement for power. Paranoia was. There were kings who reigned with wisdom, briefly, quietly. But more often, history remembers the tyrants, men who ruled not to serve the people, but to break them. One such king once ordered a village to be razed for sheltering a rebel. Not just the rebel's home, but every home. Women with children were locked inside their huts, thatched roofs set alight. Screams were muffled by the roar of fire, and when it was done, he ordered salt to be sown into the blackened earth. So, nothing would grow again. Another king, fearing betrayal from the Highlands, demanded hostages from every clan chief, sons and daughters sent to live in the royal court. They were paraded like trophies. Their lives dangled over their family's obedience. One girl, no older than 10, was said to have cried each night for her father. When he joined a rebellion, she vanished, her name erased from all records. Only her nurse remembered her, and was later found drowned. Taxes were another tool of tyranny. They came in the form of grain, labour, wool, and blood. A man might work from dawn to dusk, only to see his best harvest taken by the king's men. If he protested, he was lashed, or worse, labelled a traitor. Entire villages starved so that the king's banquets could overflow with meat and foreign wine. He ruled with divine right, or so the priests claimed. To question him was to question God. But the people questioned, if not allowed, then in their hearts. They saw their children go cold in winter while the king wrapped himself in imported furs. They buried mothers, while priests blessed the palace halls with gold dust and incense. And when whispers of rebellion stirred, so did the king's cruelty. His spies were everywhere. Monks, merchants, even musicians. A stray comment near a fireplace might find you in shackles come morning. Punishments were designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. One noble who challenged the king was flayed alive before his family, his skin nailed to the gates of his own estate. Another had molten lead poured down his throat. To silence the lies, the king had said. And yet still, resistance simmered. In hidden glens, around peat fires, men whispered of justice, of rightful rule, of kings who should kneel before their people, not crush them. But such talk was dangerous. It could cost your land, your clan, your name. Still, there were revolts. Small, savage, doomed. Farmers with pitchforks against armored. Knights, clans who struck quickly, then vanished into the mist. They didn't aim to win. They aimed to be heard. And often they weren't, because the king's scribes wrote history, and the king's priests preached obedience, and the king's executioners ensured quiet. But tyranny breeds desperation, and desperation, when cornered, fights back. One winter, a group of serfs poisoned the grain they delivered to the royal storehouses. Dozens of the king's hounds died. Several guards grew ill. It was discovered. The village was burned. Every male over 12 was beheaded. The rest sold into slavery. Still, the whispers didn't die, because even tyrants die. And when they do, their statues crumble faster than their victims are forgotten. Their tombs are defaced, their names cursed in song, their bloodlines hunted. And still, the damage they left behind lingers like rot beneath stone. Children raised in fear do not forget easily. Neither do widows. Neither do the poor who watched their last loaf taken in, the name of a man who never knew their names. And perhaps the cruelest truth of all. Some kings believed they were doing right, that their iron grip was necessary. That order required suffering. That loyalty must be forged through fire and fear. They called it justice, but to the people it was just tyranny with a crown. And so medieval Scotland learned to bow when ordered, but never with both knees. Learned to obey with words, but defy with eyes. Learned to survive beneath kings until they didn't. Because no crown is eternal, but the scars it leaves behind, those last forever. They came from across the sea. Longboats carved like dragons, slicing through black waters. Oars cutting rhythmically, silently. Sails low and dark, catching the wind like wings of shadow. The Vikings. To the people of medieval Scotland's coasts, Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, they did not come as men. They came as nightmares. They brought no warnings, no banners, only fire, steel, and hunger. And they came often. In the beginning, the islanders thought they were just pirates, brutal but human. But as the raids grew bolder, the truth became clearer. These were not simple seafarers. They were conquerors. And they treated Scotland's western shores not as neighbours, but as prey. A crofter in the Hebrides might wake to the sound of horns, not church bells, not cattle calls, but the low, bone-deep wail of something coming for him. By the time he reached the shore, the longboats were already there. Warriors leaping into the surf with axes in both hands, mouths open in fury, shields thundering against their chests. There was rarely time to run, and nowhere to hide. Stone huts were no match for flame. Wooden chapels ignited like dry grass. The screams of women and children mixed with the clash of steel, and the shouts of men whose language was foreign and terrifying. Some villagers were killed outright, others taken. Not out of mercy, but as slaves. The Vikings valued strong backs, quiet mouths, and youthful bodies. Children were torn from mothers, men forced to row the very boats that had destroyed their homes, women shackled and bound for distant markets. The lucky ones died quickly, but not all raids ended in death. Some Vikings stayed. They saw fertile land, good fishing, untapped wealth. And so they built settlements, intermarried, took what they wanted, and offered gifts in return: axes, for loyalty, coin, for silence, protection, in exchange for obedience. And over time, the lines blurred. Some Scottish clans allied with the Norse. Some even adopted their customs, wore their jewellery, learned their tongue. Others refused, and were crushed beneath the boots of men who laughed as they burned entire villages to ash. There are sagas, written in runes and songs, of great battles between Viking warlords and Highland chiefs, of blood spilled knee-deep in the glens, of ships dragging the dead home, draped in the enemy's tartan, and there are whispers, quieter, darker, of the monsters that came with them. Because the Norse didn't just bring steel. They brought stories of Draugr, undead warriors who walked at night seeking revenge, of sea witches who cursed fishermen and sank boats with songs, of shapeshifters and wolves that wore human skin. And in the foggy mornings after a raid, when villagers found their dead with mouths twisted in terror, some began to believe the monsters were real, because sometimes bodies went missing, and sometimes the mist moved like something breathing. But folklore aside, the real monster was hunger for power. The Norse expansion across Scotland wasn't just a series of raids, it was an occupation, a slow erasure of native culture, the carving of new borders, the renaming of lands. What once was Dalriada became Norse Gaelic territory. What once was sacred was desecrated, repurposed, or forgotten. The church tried to fight back. Missionaries were sent to Norse-occupied lands to preach peace, to convert the pagans. Some succeeded. Many were killed, crucified upside down, gutted and left for wolves. And still, the Vikings came, because death was not a deterrent. For them, it was glory. To die in battle was to earn a place in Valhalla. And what better battlefield than the edge of the world? A savage land ruled by stone and blood. To the Norse, Scotland was not hell. It was home. Eventually, the power shifted. Viking influence declined. Kings of Alba fought back. The Scottish crown, growing stronger, pushed westward. But the scars remained. Some villages never recovered. Some families never returned. And some traditions, dark, strange, Norse in origin, took root and remained in the bones of the culture. A turn of phrase, a carving on a stone, a ritual performed each winter in silence. They say that on certain nights, when the wind comes in from the sea, the old ghosts ride with it. You can hear their boats creaking, hear the war horns low in the fog, hear the splash of oars, rhythmic, distant, steady. And if you stand too close to the shore, they say, you might hear your own name, because death didn't leave the coast of Scotland. It simply anchored there. It didn't arrive with a scream. It came in silence. A silence so thick it smothered the birdsong and stole the wind from the glen. The first to fall was a shepherd. Just a cough, they said. Then came the fever, the shaking, the blackened fingertips. By the time they found him slumped against a fence post, his mouth was full of blood and his flock scattered. Then came his wife, then their children. By the end of the week, the house stood empty and no one dared enter it. The Black Death had reached medieval Scotland, not in a wave, but in tendrils, quiet and slow, crawling from the lowlands up through the high passes, seeping into the glens like mist, carried not by warriors but by rats, fleas and breath. At first people didn't understand. It was a curse, surely, or punishment, or witchcraft. The priests said it was sin, that God was angry. They urged fasting, prayer, penance, but none of. It stopped the dying. It didn't care if you were noble or peasant, laird or servant. If you drew breath, you could die, and most did. Villages emptied in days. Entire families vanished, their doors swinging open in the wind. Carts rolled down muddy roads filled not with hay, but with corpses, piled like firewood. The symptoms were grotesque. Boils the size of apples, skin that turned purple, then black, tongues swollen until no words could form. The stench of rot, of sweat, of blood, hung in every hut. But worse than the sickness was the fear. People stopped helping each other. Mothers turned from children. Brothers left brothers to die alone. Priests fled their flocks. The dying were left where they fell, on floors in fields, by hearths gone cold. The living were haunted not by ghosts, but by silence. No clanging of church bells, no laughter of children, no barking dogs, just the occasional cough, the rustle of something moving behind closed doors, and the crows, always watching. In the Highlands, news travelled slower, but so did hope. They burned bodies. They quarantined huts. They marked doors with crosses and tied bundles of herbs above the lintel. Anything to keep the sickness out. It rarely worked. Some villages turned to superstition. Bonfires lit on hilltops, offerings left by streams. Old women consulted for charms and prayers, but nothing stopped it. One tale tells of a glen where the people dug a massive trench and forced the sick inside. Dozens of them. They sealed it with logs, then lit it. They said it was mercy. The screams said otherwise. Some believed the plague was carried by the wind, that the mist itself was poison. So they sealed windows, plugged chimney holes, smothered fires, and waited. But death didn't need an open door. It came all the same. Yet, amid the horror, there were flickers of humanity. A boy who carried soup to a dying elder, knowing he'd likely die too. A mother who sat with her fevered child, singing, until her voice gave out. A monk who stayed behind, praying over the dead until the rats took his eyes. They were not saints. They were just people, but they mattered, and they were remembered. Those who survived were never the same. They emerged gaunt, hollow-eyed, afraid of touch. They flinched at every cough. They washed their hands with ash and water. Some never spoke again. Some took to the hills and lived alone for the rest of their days. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it broke spirits. It left holes in families, gaps in villages, scars in memory. Churches were abandoned, fields overgrown, roads empty. And in some places the dead outnumbered the living so completely that no one was left to bury them. Mass graves were dug, some marked, many not. You can still find them if you know where to look. Low hills where nothing grows, stones stacked without names, crosses weathered by centuries of wind. They are silent now, but in the stillness, you can almost hear the coughing, almost smell the smoke, almost feel the chill that comes not from winter, but from dread. The church eventually rewrote the story, said it was a divine test, that those who survived were chosen, that Scotland had endured through faith. But the people knew better. It wasn't faith that saved them. It was luck, or accident, or something darker. Some villages, completely untouched, were later cursed for surviving, called witches, called devil-born. Some were burned, not by plague, but by their neighbours, because survival too became suspicious, and so the plague passed, as all things do, but it left behind a land quieter, a people wary. Songs that once praised kings and warriors now spoke of fire and sickness, and the day the world turned cold. They say the glens never fully healed, that the soil remembers the rot, that on misty mornings, if you walk alone through certain woods, you might feel a hand, not warm, not cold, brush yours, that if you follow the sound of weeping, you won't come back. Perhaps it's just memory, or perhaps some sicknesses never truly die. They wait like breath behind the door. They were never named, no record in the kirk, no place in the family tree, no stone to mark their passing, no one to say he was mine, or she belonged to us. They were the children of the mist. In medieval Scotland, not every child was born into a cradle. Some were born into silence, into secrecy, into fear. Sometimes the birth was unwanted. A servant girl seduced, or worse, coerced by a visiting noble. A farmer's daughter shamed by a travelling monk. A young woman who never said a word, only grew quieter as her belly did. There were no midwives for these children, only shaking hands and straw-strewn floors. And when they arrived, wet and wailing, there was no celebration, only decisions. Some were hidden, swaddled in rags and kept in the darkest corner of the hut, passed off as the child of a dead sister, or an orphan rescued by pity. Others were taken into the woods, left beside running water, with a charm tucked into their blanket, a final hope that the fae might take them, or the wolves, whichever came first, and some, too many, were buried before their first breath had finished echoing. But not all lost children were newborns. Some were abandoned later, when the hunger came. When too many mouths begged for too little bread. When winter closed in like a noose, and the youngest, weakest, quietest simply disappeared. A family would not speak of it. They would say, "She went to live with an aunt," or "He was taken by fever," or simply, "Nothing at all." The neighbours would nod. They understood, because they too had made choices. There were also orphans born of war, of raids, of plague. A boy who watched his mother burn as Vikings laughed. A girl who crawled from a hut filled with corpses, her hands stained black with soot and rot. No one came for them, so they ran, into the glens, into the mists, into legend. These children survived in ways no child should have to. Some joined bands of thieves, learned to pick pockets in market towns, slept beneath carts, ate from the dung pile, stole crusts from sleeping dogs. Others wandered the wilderness, made homes beneath tree roots, built traps for rabbits, learned the language of crows. There were stories of a girl who lived in the peat bogs, wrapped in a coat made of sheep's wool and bramble thorns, with eyes like stormlight and a knife always near her ribs. Some became servants, taken into castles and manors, not out of kindness, but convenience. They were cheap, pliable, and quiet. Too quiet. The lucky ones were beaten. The unlucky, worse. But worst of all was being forgotten. To have no name, no kin, no voice. To exist only as a pair of eyes in the dark. A shadow sweeping. The ashes. A ragged hand holding a jug too heavy for its wrist. And yet, some of them endured. Some of them grew strong. There's a tale from Lochaber about a boy who was raised by monks after they found him curled on the church steps, half frozen, a scrap of tartan sewn into his shirt. He grew into a man of quiet, wrath, silent but deadly with a bow. It's said he led a rebellion years later, his name never known, only the wind whispering, Mistborn. In the folklore of the Highlands, the children of the mist came to mean more than just orphans. They became spirits of sorrow and revenge, pale figures seen watching from the edge of the forest, voices calling out from the moor at night. They were not ghosts. They were grief embodied. Some clans even claimed descent from such children, foundlings who carried the blood of kings or saints, raised by wolves or witches, destined for greatness. It made for good stories, and sometimes it was even true. But for every tale of glory, there were 100 forgotten. The boy whose bones were found decades later in a cave, arms wrapped around a doll carved from bone. The girl whose voice no one ever remembered hearing, even as she served their meals. The infant left in a cradle of reeds, floating down the river into nothing. We do not know their names, but they shaped Scotland as surely as any king, because pain leaves marks deeper than stone, because absence shapes as much as presence, because silence, when long enough, becomes a kind of scream. In old age, some Highlanders claimed to see them still, small figures at the edge of the mist, watching, not malicious, just waiting, not for revenge, but for recognition. It began with a word, not a sword, not a scream, just a word spoken at the wrong time, in the wrong place, to the wrong person, and it could cost you your life. In medieval Scotland, faith was not simply belief, it was power and heresy. The act of questioning that power was treason wrapped in scripture. The church ruled not only souls, but bodies. It claimed dominion over land, law, and language. To challenge its teachings was to challenge the order of the world. And the punishment for such defiance was not exile. It was fire. Not immediately, of course. The fire came later. First came the whispers. She speaks Latin too well for a woman. He reads books not sanctioned by the abbot. She questions the priest's sermons. He asks why we pay so much in tithes. Curiosity was dangerous. Literacy, even more so, especially when found in the hands of those not born noble, especially in the Highlands, where isolation bred independence, and independence invited suspicion. The church feared the mind as much as it feared the devil, and so it watched, listened, recorded. There were informants in every village, men who would trade their neighbor's soul for favor, a glance, a phrase. A single complaint during Mass could be enough to summon judgment. The process was methodical, cold. First came the inquisitor, often a pale man in dark robes, traveling with guards and scribes. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He asked questions, so many questions. Do you believe in the authority of Rome? Have you ever read forbidden texts? Do you believe the bread becomes the body of Christ? Your answers were written down, compared, analyzed. Contradictions were noted like wounds. And even if you passed, if you were found clean, you were never free again. You were marked, watched, feared. But if your answers displeased them, then came the chains, then came the cell, and finally, the trial. Though calling it a trial was generous, it was theatre. You were already guilty. Some were tortured before confession. The wheel, the rack, the iron boot, not to punish, but to extract the truth, or what the church needed to be the truth. A man might hold out for days, but eventually everyone broke. Bones could not argue. Flesh had no faith strong enough, and once the confession was given, the fire was prepared. Execution was public. It had to be. To burn one soul. To save 100. The accused was dressed in a simple robe, sometimes barefoot, sometimes gagged, a wooden cross placed near them, whether they wanted it or not. The stake was set in the village square or on a nearby hill where all could see. Wood stacked high, oil poured in slow circles. And then the priest would speak. He would read verses, pray aloud, speak of mercy, of redemption, of cleansing fire. Then he would nod, and the torch would be lit. The fire did not start fast. It crackled, then roared, then screamed. Some died quickly, most did not. The crowd was silent. Children hid their faces. Women wept. Men crossed themselves. No one looked away, because to look away was to question, and to question was to risk joining the flames. Those burned for heresy were not all rebels. Some were healers, some were scholars, some were simply too bold. A woman who translated Psalms into Gaelic, a monk who copied a banned manuscript, a teacher who taught that God might live in the trees as well as the sky. Not all believed themselves heretics, but it didn't matter. Belief was not the measure, obedience was, and obedience meant fear. But still, heresy lived on, in hidden books, passed from hand to hand beneath cloaks, in whispered prayers not found in church, in caves where monks once hid from Roman eyes, in songs that remembered the names of the burned. There were places where the church dared not go, places where the wind carried older words, where the cross bowed before stone circles, and the saints wore the faces of forgotten gods. In these places, heresy was not a sin. It was survival. And as the centuries passed, the ashes of the burned did not scatter. They seeded the soil, and from them ideas grew, quietly, bravely, inevitably, because fire can kill a man, but it cannot kill a question. The bogs do not speak, but they do not forget. They lie still across the Scottish landscape, vast, quiet, heavy with mist, unmoving but never dead. Beneath their surface, water ripples slowly, hiding secrets in layers of peat and silence. To walk across a bog is to step over history, and sometimes over bones. In medieval Scotland, the bogs were feared, not just for their danger, but for what they hid. They were places of disposal, of disappearance, of death without witness. When a body was cast into a bog, it did not rot. It waited. Trapped in layers of mud and moss, the flesh stayed preserved, eyelids sealed shut, fingernails intact, hair clinging to skulls as if time had stopped. And it had, because bogs are not like earth. They are not for burial, but for erasure. But who were these people? Some were criminals, thieves perhaps, or killers. Judged not in courtrooms, but by the clan. Punished not with rope, but with silence. A death with no grave, no priest, no stone. Others were sacrifices. The old ways of Scotland, older than Rome, older even than the church, spoke of blood for balance. A harsh winter, a withered harvest, a sickness spreading too fast. Offerings were made, sometimes food, sometimes animals, sometimes people. Tales tell of chosen ones. Young men or women, blessed or cursed, walked into the bogs at dawn, garlands around their necks, faces painted with ash, silent, serene, resigned. They were pushed gently beneath the surface and never seen again. There were those who resisted, struggled, fought to live, and there were those who went willingly, believing that death would save the village, that their soul would rise in the mist, that the bog would accept them and speak to the gods on their behalf. These stories were not written, but they were remembered by the old women who sang while stirring soup, by the blacksmith who whispered a name before the fire roared, by the mothers who warned their children not to stray too close to the soft ground, or the bog will take you, and sometimes it did, not for sacrifice, not for justice, but for convenience. In times of war, a body meant questions. A missing man might be mourned, but a discovered corpse, that started feuds. So when a man needed to disappear quietly, the bog was perfect. No grave to mark, no bones to accuse, no echo of the final scream, just bubbles rising, just silence, just the slow folding of peat over flesh and regret. But the bogs were not merely burial grounds. They were boundaries, spiritual borders between the living and the lost. People believed that the bogs hummed with voices, not ghosts exactly, but memories. That if you stood still long enough, you might hear whispers, or feel a hand brush your ankle, or see the shape of something beneath the surface, looking up. In some villages, bogs were used for punishment. A man accused of betrayal might be tied and left waist-deep until nightfall. If he survived, he was judged innocent. If he sank, it was said that the bog had passed sentence. The church tried to stop this, called it pagan, blasphemous. But even the priests avoided the bogs after dark, because while scripture ruled the kirk, the bog answered to older gods. Centuries later, the bones began to surface. A foot found by a shepherd, a hand curled into a fist of dried leather, a skull smiling through strands of preserved hair. Archaeologists call them bog bodies now. They examine the cuts, the ropes, the broken ribs. They ask questions science cannot answer. Why was this woman blindfolded? Why was this man stabbed, then strangled, then buried? Why did someone place hazelnuts and coins in the mouths of children? But no answers come, because the bog doesn't explain. It only remembers. It keeps the weight of secrets, of sins, of sacrifices. It cradles the forgotten and the feared, the guilty and the innocent, the murdered and the mourned. And beneath its surface, time is not a river, it is a trap. Even today, in certain corners of Scotland, farmers will not plough near the bog. Children are warned not to play by its edge. Some paths veer wide around it, though the way is longer. Old habits, older fears. Because deep down, people still believe. The bog watches, and beneath the moss and water and years, someone is still waiting, Love was not a luxury in medieval Scotland. Marriage was never about roses, nor poems, nor whispers under moonlight. It was a bargain, cold, calculated, and often cruel. To be born a woman in that world was to be born into terms and conditions. You were not raised for independence, but for exchange. Your worth was counted, not in talents or thoughts, but in dowries, in land, in alliances, and the cost of a bride was everything. Fathers arranged matches before a girl's voice had even finished changing. Sometimes before she could read, sometimes before she could walk. Her future promised to a man she'd never met, whose breath would one day mix with hers under a roof not her own. Her consent, irrelevant. Marriage was a contract, between fathers, between clans, between kings. A joining of bloodlines, a sealing of treaties, a payment of debt, and once the bargain was struck, it was binding. To break it meant war. She was dressed in linen, not lace, her hair braided by women who spoke in hushed tones, her lips painted red not for beauty, but for symbolism, blood, fertility, obedience. The church ceremony was brief, the feast longer, but through all of it she was watched, by new family, by old rivals, by strangers waiting to see if she would please her new lord. And after the last cup was drained, came the bedding, a public ritual in some places. Guests gathered to escort the couple to their chamber. The sheets examined come morning for blood, proof of virtue. No stain meant shame. Whispered rumours. In some cases, annulment. In others, punishment. Because a woman who came to marriage unclean was accused not of indiscretion, but of betrayal. The man, of course, faced no such judgment. Once married, her body was no longer hers. It belonged to her husband, to his desires, to his lineage. She was a vessel for heirs, a keeper of legacy, a womb with a face. If she failed to produce a son, it was her fault. If she bore too many daughters, it was her shame. If she lost a child in childbirth, it was her curse. And childbirth, oh, the pain of it. No painkillers, no sanitation, no mercy. She would scream into cloth, gripping the arms of women who prayed louder than she did. She might bleed for hours. She might never rise again. And if the baby died, she was expected to try again. Soon. Love? It came later, if it came at all. And yet, many women endured, adapted. Some even found ways to carve power from their chains. A clever wife could influence her husband's decisions. A strong mother could guide her sons toward diplomacy. A widow, if she survived long enough, could own land, manage estates, and in rare cases, rule. But the price was steep. For every woman who rose quietly in status, 100 more were beaten, silenced, discarded. A man could accuse his wife of witchcraft for speaking out, for disobedience, for refusing him at night. And that accusation could end in flames. Some women fled, ran into the hills with only their name and their breath. Some joined outlaw bands. Some vanished into abbeys, hoping that a life of prayer might offer peace. And some jumped into rivers. The marriage bargain broke many, but it was not limited to nobility. Even the poor felt its grip. A crofter might trade his daughter to a blacksmith for 3 goats and a promise of shelter. A shepherd's girl might be forced to marry a man twice her age to settle a debt. Love was for songs and dreams, not for life. And still, some found it. In rare moments, beneath starlit skies, away from duty and debt, 2 souls might find something real. A shared glance, a tender touch, a whispered vow not written in ink or sealed in blood, but spoken in truth. But such love was dangerous. Forbidden love led to elopement. Elopement led to exile. Exile often led to death. And so, most kept quiet, swallowed their dreams, smiled when told, stood beside men they didn't choose, and lived half lives. Until one day, when they were no longer young, they might look out across the glen and whisper, not to be heard, I was not born for this, but it was already done. The bargain was sealed, and their name was not written in history, only on stones that said wife, mother, obedient. Forgotten, the night did not begin with thunder. It began with hooves, soft at first, distant, like a memory galloping across the hills, then louder, closer. A rhythm no one mistook for anything else. The Rivers were coming. In the shadowy borderlands between Scotland and England, where the maps blurred and the laws were meaningless, the Rivers ruled the dark, clan-based raiders, born from poverty, vengeance, and generations of blood feud. They did not come for justice. They came for cattle and coin, and sometimes for bodies. The borders were a land of twilight loyalties, too Scottish for the English crown, too English for the Scottish throne. Caught in the crossfire of kings and lords who cared little for the crofts that burned in their name. So the people of the border learned not to ask for protection. They learned to take, to raid, to rob, to survive, and at the heart of this culture were the Rivers, riders who moved like smoke, who knew every hill, every stream, every unguarded path. They struck fast and vanished faster, leaving only hoofprints, blood, and burning thatch behind them. The attack always came at night, while dogs slept, while fires burned low, while men dreamed of peace they'd never know. A horn might sound, low and long, not to warn, but to signal. By then, it was too late. You woke to shouts, to the clash of steel, to hooves in your yard, to your cattle, your lifeline, being driven into the dark. Sometimes you fought. More often, you fled. Because to stand against the Rivers was to risk everything. They were not soldiers bound by code. They were wolves in the skin of men. They showed no mercy. They needed none. They took what they could carry. What they couldn't, they burned. And if they found resistance, they made examples. A crofter strung up by his heels from a barn beam. A child left crying beside a dead father. A house set ablaze while the family still slept inside. These were not crimes to the Rivers. They were tradition. In the harsh economy of the borders, strength was currency, honor, a weapon, revenge, inherited. One raid begot another. A stolen cow led to a stolen child, a burned croft to a poisoned well. Clan against clan, blood for blood. The authorities tried to intervene. They built towers, peel towers, stone fortresses, dotting the landscape like broken teeth, meant to protect, meant to intimidate. But the Rivers laughed at towers. They rode around them, over them, through them. The kings issued proclamations, bounties, punishments, but the borderers spoke their own language and followed only one law, the blackmail. Pay the Rivers, or face the night. It wasn't extortion. It was survival. Even the church paid at times. Even nobles, even those who condemned them by day, fed them by night. Because everyone knew, someday, your turn would come. And when it did, no prayer could unhorse a River. Despite their violence, the Rivers were not wild. They were organized, structured, proud. Each clan bore its own badge, its own code, its own history. Children were taught to ride before they could walk, taught to track by moonlight, to kill without noise, to vanish before dawn. They carried names that still echo in the borders today. Armstrong, Elliot, Scott, Nixon, Curdot, names that filled the ledgers of both English and Scottish prisons. Names spoken with both fear and admiration, because for all their savagery, the Rivers were also heroes, to some, to the poor farmer whose crops were stolen by a noble, to the widow who lost her home to taxes, to the peasant trampled by armies who never knew his name. To them, the Rivers were justice, bloody, uneven, unholy, but justice all the same. They kept balance in a lawless land. And when they died, they were buried, not as criminals, but as legends, with blades across their chests, with boots still muddy, with horses tethered nearby so their spirits could ride again. As the sun rose after a raid, the land was quiet once more. The smoke drifted. The cattle were gone. The survivors wept, or planned vengeance, and the ravers, they were already miles away, feasting, laughing, sharpening blades for the next ride. It's said that when the wind howls through the border valleys, it carries more than cold. It carries the echo of hooves, the sound of vengeance, of rebellion, of the night when peace died and survival rode, because in that world, you were either a victim or a river. The ale was bitter that night, not from poor brewing, but from tension, the kind that settles in a room like smoke, the kind that clings to cloaks and curls into the corners of a tavern just before steel is drawn. In medieval Scotland, taverns were more than places of drink. They were confessionals without priests, courts without judgment, and sometimes execution sites without gallows. The fire crackled. Men drank, women served, but no one laughed too loud or stared too long, because in a world ruled by grudges, one wrong word was enough. You didn't just drink with friends in a Scottish tavern. You drank with rivals, with spies, with ghosts. A man entered alone, dust on his boots and a dirk hidden at his waist. His eyes swept the room. He wasn't looking for warmth. He was weighing the risk. He ordered mead, sat near the fire and watched. It was always the quiet ones you feared. The ones who sipped slowly, who never raised their voice. The ones who toasted with steady hands. Because often, those hands had killed before. Poison was not rare. A drop in a tankard. A dusting on meat. A slow death that let the killer walk away unnoticed. No need for blades when honeyed drink could carry bitterness to the heart. That's why some men brought tasters, slaves or servants or sons-in-law. Others drank nothing at all, just sat, dry-mouthed, while pretending to enjoy the music. Still, the tavern was unavoidable. It was where deals were made, where alliances were tested, where betrayal slipped between laughter like a knife in the ribs. The walls had ears. The barkeep knew more than most priests. And the fiddler in the corner, he'd seen 3 murders and spoken of none. Because in the right tavern, with the right coin, you could buy anything, a secret, a sword arm, a death, and if you stayed too long, death might come uninvited. Some nights, the ale ran red before the fire did, a spilled drink, a misheard insult, a glance at the wrong woman. Suddenly, chairs flew, knives flashed, and the floor was painted with blood and broken glass. And when it was over, the survivors drank again, to forget, to celebrate, to dull the guilt, because no one walked into a tavern without knowing the rules. Rule 1. Trust no one. That man who bought you a drink. He might be softening you for a question. That woman who smiled across the room. She might carry more than a dagger in her bodice. That old friend from the next glen over. He might still carry the grudge from 10 winters past. Rule 2. Know where the exits are. Every man of sense sat with his back to the wall. Every door was memorized. Every window a possible escape. A smart man never drank so deeply he couldn't run. Rule 3. Don't toast with enemies unless you're ready to die with them, because every cup raised might be your last. There were stories, too many, of men who never left the tavern. Some found in the privy, throat slit. Others in the alley behind, purse missing. Some simply vanished, their last words shared over frothy ale. And yet, they still came. Because the tavern offered something else too, shelter. For a few hours you were off the battlefield. You sat by the fire, ate hot meat, listened to songs older than memory, laughed even, quietly, and for a moment you remembered what it was like to be just a man, not a warrior, not a thief, not a killer, just a man with calloused hands and a mug half full. There were friendships forged in firelight. oaths made with slurred words and clasped hands, songs shared that brought tears to eyes too proud for weeping. And there was love, sometimes, fleeting, foolish, real, but it always ended, because in the morning the fire died, the mead ran out, the sun returned, and so did duty. You went back to your land, your war, your feud. You saddled your horse, you counted your knives, and you prayed you'd never have to see that tavern again, because if you did, it meant trouble. Still, some couldn't stay away. Like moths to flame, they returned, for comfort, for danger, for the chance to feel something, because, in a life so brutal, so cold, even a drink with death was better than dying alone. And so they sat, men and women alike, around flickering fires in low-roofed taverns. They told stories, made bargains, shared lies, and when the time came, they drank, to health, to war, to those they'd buried, to those they planned to bury, and across the tavern, someone always watched, someone who had not come for ale, only for the silence that followed the scream. He came from nowhere. No clan claimed him. No priest knew his baptism. No mother wept for his memory. He was simply there. In medieval Scotland, a man without a name was more than a mystery. He was a threat. For names meant history. Names meant loyalty. And a man who owed no allegiance owed no debt to mercy. They called him Black Hugh, or the Quiet One. Some swore he'd escaped from the dungeons of Edinburgh. Others said he was birthed by the wind on the edge of a cliff. But most said nothing at all, because when he entered a village, people closed their doors. He did not travel by road. He came by deer paths, by riverbeds, by the spaces between maps. His boots left no prints. His cloak always dry, even when it rained. His eyes, no one described them the same way. He was not young, but not old. He did not beg. He did not barter. He only watched, and yet death followed him like a dog. The first time he appeared, a laird's son was found dead near a frozen stream. His neck twisted, his dirk missing. The villagers whispered, but no one saw anything. The second time, a church caught fire. The priest escaped, but the altar did not. They said the man had been seen sitting outside the kirk 2 days before, sharpening a blade that didn't shine. By the third time, people learned. Don't speak to him. Don't offer food. Don't ask questions, because if he spoke back, it meant he'd noticed you. And if he noticed you, your days were numbered. But not all feared him. Some sought him out. Desperate men, usually. Men with grudges, with enemies, with gold hidden in sacks tied to their belts. They found him by leaving signs, 3 stones on a stump, or a feather, tied with red string to a fence post. If he came, he said nothing. He only listened. You'd make your case. Describe the man who wronged you, the field that was stolen, the daughter that was taken, the brother that was betrayed, and when you finished, he would nod, or he wouldn't. If he nodded, your revenge would come, quiet, swift, irreversible. But the price was never coin. It was something deeper, a secret, a favor owed, a memory you would never speak of again. And sometimes the ones who hired him disappeared too, because the man with no name was no tool. He served no one. He moved for reasons only he understood. Justice, revenge, chaos. No one knew. He did not kill loudly. His victims were not found in blood-soaked beds or open fields. They were found alone, cold, with their faces covered, as if he granted them a final mercy, to not see the blade. But others said it was a curse, that he covered their faces to stop them from haunting him, that each soul he took followed him, whispering in his ear as he slept, if he slept at all. Some say he didn't age, that he'd been seen 30 years apart looking exactly the same. Others said he died long ago and walks still because he has no grave. Children were told tales of him. If you don't sleep, the man with no name will come. If you lie, he'll hear it on the wind. If you take what isn't yours, he'll return it, in blood. But even children could sense the truth. He wasn't a monster. He was a mirror. He came where pain lingered, where cruelty festered, where the law had failed, where the church had looked away. He did what others wouldn't or couldn't, and in that he was both feared and needed. There are those who claim to have met him and lived. A woman who said he carried a bird with a broken wing, a beggar who swore the man gave him half a loaf of bread, a dying knight found with a wound that should have killed, but didn't. He spared me, the knight whispered, because I told the truth. But no one could prove these stories, because the man with no name never stayed. He arrived when the mist was thickest and left before the crows stirred. No tracks, no witness, just silence, and a world a little more empty, or a little more just, depending on who you were. The gallows stood long before the crowd gathered, a crooked frame of wood soaked with rain and memory. It didn't need a name. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. In medieval Scotland, the gallows wasn't just a tool of death. It was a lesson, a sermon, a final punctuation mark on the story of a life. And that story always ended in silence. At dawn, the condemned was woken, if they'd slept at all. Shackled, sore, eyes hollowed by nights of prayer or rage. A priest would walk beside them, murmuring blessings. Sometimes the condemned joined in. More often, they said nothing. What was left to say? The walk to the gallows was deliberate, through the centre of the village or market square, past neighbours, past kin, past the baker who once gave them bread, past the boy who once played with their son. No one reached out. To touch the condemned was to invite their fate. To speak to them was to be remembered by the wrong people. So the villagers stood quiet, eyes lowered, hands clasped, waiting for the end. The scaffold creaked as boots touched the planks. The executioner waited with the patience of someone who'd done this before. Hood drawn, hands steady. He did not ask questions. He did not offer comfort. He did not believe in second chances. The rope hung like an accusation. Sometimes, the condemned gave a speech, spoke of innocence, or guilt, or vengeance. Some cried, some laughed, some cursed the crowd with such fury that the priest stepped away. But others simply looked at the horizon, as if searching for something no one else could see. Their crimes varied: thieves, murderers, rebels, witches, traitors. Some had taken lives, some had taken cattle, some had taken only the wrong side in the wrong war. Justice was not blind in Scotland. It wore the face of the powerful. And when the powerful wished to remind the weak, the gallows was erected in plain view. Children watched from rooftops. Wives held their husbands' arms. Lords sipped wine from balconies above. Because this was more than punishment. It was theatre. It was meant to linger in the minds of those who thought they were safe. And yet, even the noose was not always final. Sometimes the rope broke. The crowd gasped. Some crossed themselves. Superstition stirred. "It's a sign," they whispered. He was innocent, but the executioner always returned, fixed the knot, tightened the wood, and dropped them again. Because in this world, innocence was not absolution. It was inconvenience. There were stories of pardons, royal decrees sent too late, a rider galloping toward the scaffold, waving parchment, screaming, "Stop!" But the rope was faster. The letter opened only after the body stopped twitching, a cruel joke, or perhaps a reminder. That mercy often arrived after death. In some places, the condemned was forced to dig their own grave before walking to the gallows. A final indignity, a cruel efficiency, and yet others sang. Songs passed down through generations, verses full of sorrow, pride, rebellion. I walk the road of stone and straw, my name forgotten, broken law. But when I fall, I rise anew. In memory's mist, I'll walk with you. The people listened. They always listened. Because no matter, the crime, the condemned belonged to them. Once, they had shared bread, shared drink, shared stories. And now, they shared silence. After the drop, the crowd did not cheer. They turned away, back to fields, to work, to ordinary life. The body hung until sundown, a warning, a reminder, a ghost made flesh. Some were taken down, buried, in unmarked pits. Others left until the birds took what was left. And the gallows waited for the next name. Because in a land ruled by fear, death was never the end. It was a pause, a breath, and somewhere nearby, another rope was being tied. A croft was not a house. It was a sentence, a low structure of stone and thatch, barely taller than a man. One door, no chimney, a hole in the roof to let smoke out or rain in, earth floors that turned to mud every winter, a fire that burned, peat instead of wood, filling the room with a heavy, sour smoke that clung to skin, to clothes, to lungs. In medieval Scotland, the croft was where life began and where it slowly unravelled. From the outside, it looked peaceful, nestled in the folds of green hills, heather blooming around it, sheep grazing nearby. But inside, the story was different. The air was always damp. The beds, straw and fleas. The ceiling so low you had to stoop, even when you were small. Chickens, nested in corners. Cattle slept beside you in winter, not out of affection, but because their bodies gave heat. A family of 6 lived in a space no larger than a stable. The father worked the land. The mother worked everything else. The children were born into toil, and if they were lucky, they lived long enough to feel tired. The land was stingy. Every morning, the farmer stepped out into the wind and looked across a patch of soil barely deep enough to grow weeds. Rocks jutted like old bones. The plough groaned through the earth. Oats might take. Barley, if the season was kind. Potatoes, if they came at all, would come later. When harvest failed, there was no backup. No granary, no stored wealth. Only hunger. The taxes came regardless. A noble, or a factor, or a man with a horse and a cold smile would arrive once a season. He did not care if the crop was thin. He did not care if the cow died. He wanted what was owed. Grain, eggs, labour. Sometimes, coin, often blood. If you could not pay, your tools were taken. Your door torn from its hinges. Your eldest son forced to serve. Your daughter married off. Or worse. The church took its share too. Tithes, they called them. 1/10 of everything you owned, given to God by way of the priest, who lived in a house twice the size of yours, with glass in the windows. You still knelt on Sundays, still prayed, still kissed the ring, because to defy the church was to invite more than poverty. It was to invite damnation. So you bowed your head, and you continued to suffer. Every crofter dreamed of more, a bigger plot, a stronger roof, a season without illness. But dreams faded under rain and routine. You rose before the sun, worked until your bones ached, ate oats with water, slept beside coughing children, woke up colder. Joy was rationed, a festival once a year, a rare wedding, the sound of a fiddle drifting from a distant hill, the first calf born healthy, a fire that didn't go out in the night. That was what passed for happiness, and still you were blamed. If the child grew sick, it was the mother's fault. If the roof caved in, it was the father's laziness. If the priest didn't visit, it was your sin. You bore guilt not only for your own failures, but for the weather, the economy, and the silence of God. Women bore more. Pregnancy after pregnancy, childbirth on dirt floors, miscarriages wrapped in linen and buried behind the croft without a marker. And when they grew older, they were expected to keep working. Keep serving, keep quiet. There was no old age, no retirement, no rest. You worked until your back broke. Then you worked with a cane. Then you sat near the fire, waiting to be useful again, or to die. When you did, there was no funeral procession. A neighbor dug a hole. A prayer was mumbled. Your body was returned to the same earth that never gave enough to feed you. No stone. Just memory, and even that faded fast, because there were too many mouths, too many bodies, too many crofts, too much misery, and no one to write the stories down. Yet still, people endured. They sang, they danced when they could. They loved, clumsily, quietly. They watched the hills and whispered to the wind. They carved their names into wooden beams. They taught their children to hope, even when there was nothing left to hope for. And that was everything. They say he played songs no man should know, tunes that made sheep flee the hills, milk turn sour, and ravens gather in the trees. His pipes weren't carved from wood, but from something darker, bone perhaps, or horn, or worse. In the old glens of medieval Scotland, where mist clings low and the wind carries whispers, people spoke of the devil's piper, never by name, only in fragments, only in warning. He came when the fog was thickest, when the air grew too still, when dogs refused to bark and fire refused to burn. That's when they'd hear it, the first note. Not a melody at first, just a sound, low, hollow, like grief stretched across a mountain, and then the music would begin. Beautiful, terrifying, impossible. No man could play like that, no living man. Some said he was a fairy cast out of the underworld. Others believed he was once a mortal piper who played in church on a Sunday, angered God, and was cursed to wander forever. But most knew better. They said he'd made a bargain, a tune in exchange for his soul. Now he played for the devil, or he was the devil. And his songs were not for joy, they were for luring. Children were the first to follow. They'd rise from their beds, barefoot and silent, eyes open but unseeing. They'd walk into the fog, into the hills, into the dark. And by morning, they were gone, forever. The lucky villagers found tiny footprints leading to cliffs, or rivers, or bogs. The unlucky found nothing at all. Parents began to keep charms by the doors, rowan branches, iron nails, blessed salt. They covered their children's ears at night, whispered prayers in old tongues, left offerings at the edge of the woods, bread, milk, the smallest coin they could spare, anything to keep the piper away. But offerings don't stop a curse, they delay it. There were stories of weddings ruined, a bride swept into the mist, her veil drifting like a ghost, of entire herds walking into the sea, enchanted by a tune no ear could forget, of priests who heard the song and tore their ears off with their own hands. The piper never spoke, only played, and wherever his music echoed, something was taken. It wasn't always a life. Sometimes it was a memory, a name, a piece of joy that never returned. There's one tale, half forgotten, of a boy who heard the music and followed. He came back 3 days later, skin pale as linen, eyes dark as coal. He never spoke again, not a single word. But every year, on that same night, he would walk to the edge of the village, face the hills, and cry. Not weep. Cry like a beast, like something torn from time. No one ever stopped him. The legend says the piper wears a cloak made of shadow, stitched with sinew. His face is hidden, not by a hood, but by the absence of one. Those who glimpse beneath it say, there's nothing there, only void, only wind, and those who stare too long vanish. But perhaps the worst story is the one people try hardest to forget. The tale of the piper who challenged him. A man from Skye, bold and proud, claimed he could outplay the devil himself. He stood atop a hill and played a tune so pure, so bright, even the trees seemed to lean closer. Then came a second melody, darker, deeper. It slithered from the glen like smoke, wrapped around the first tune, and strangled it. They found the challenger the next morning. His pipes shattered, his fingers broken, his mouth twisted into a permanent scream. No sound ever came from him again. Some say the devil's piper was once mortal, a man with too much pride, too much skill, a man who wanted to be heard by all the world, and was, now cursed to play until the end of time, never stopping, never resting, each song a toll taken, each note a bargain sealed. But there are other versions. Some say the piper is a warning, a reminder that some things should not be sought, that not every talent is a blessing, that beauty can destroy. And in Scotland, where every hill has a shadow and every loch a secret, the piper's song lingers. Even now, on certain nights, when the wind is too still and the sheep begin to stir, they say you can hear it, a tune rising from the moor, distant, cold, calling. And if you listen too long, you might follow it and never come back. The village told the story the same way every time. He left in the morning, boots laced, satchel full, said he was heading to the forest for firewood, or maybe to check the snares. He didn't say much, just nodded to his mother, kissed the dog on the head, and walked into the mist. He never came back. At first, no one worried. Men often vanished for hours. The forest was thick, the terrain rough. Maybe he twisted his ankle. Maybe he found something worth chasing. But by nightfall, the worry began to gnaw. By dawn, it screamed. They searched for 3 days. 10 men, then 20. Dogs, too. Candles burned in every window. The priest led prayers. The wise woman laid charms at the forest's edge. His mother wept into her hands until they turned red. But the boy, just 16, was nowhere. No blood, no trail, no torn cloth or broken branch. Nothing. Only silence. And the trees, watching. Some said he ran away. Others whispered it was the Fae. Some claimed he was cursed, that he'd gone where he shouldn't have. His father, who had once fought in the border wars, said only one thing. If he were dead, I'd feel it. But days turned to weeks. Then winter came, and the body never appeared. Not in the stream, not in the bog, not beneath the stones they turned over and over again. The earth had swallowed him whole, and in Scotland, that meant something more than death. It meant the land had claimed him. Because when you live on soil soaked in centuries of blood and sorrow, you learn to fear more than wolves and wind. You learn to fear vanishing. To disappear in medieval Scotland was not rare. A boy, a girl, a traveller, a priest, a hunter, they left and did not return. Sometimes it was the weather, a sudden storm, a fall into a hidden crevice. Sometimes it was men, bandits, raiders, old grudges made manifest in steel. And sometimes it was something else. They say certain glens don't like to be walked through, that the moss pulls harder on your boots, that the shadows are too deep, even at midday, that when the birds stop singing, you should turn back, no matter how close. Your goal, some disappearances were written down. A boy lost, presumed dead. No remains. Others were simply forgotten. Because if there is no body, there is no burial. And if there is no burial, the grief never ends. The mother keeps the fire burning. The father keeps the door unlatched. The sister sets a place at the table, just in case. But slowly, they stop saying his name, because the name hurts more than the silence. Years pass. The house sags. The dog dies. The snares rot in the woods. And still, no body. Then, one day, someone sees something, a figure in the mist, too tall, moving strangely, or a song. not quite human, carried on the wind, a boot print where no one has walked in years, a knife rusted and half buried. They dig again, and again, nothing. The village stops talking about it, but they don't forget, and they don't walk that path anymore. Because to lose someone to death is to know an ending, but to lose them to the unknown is to invite madness. The forests of Scotland are old, older than the stones, older than the clans, older even than the gods, and they do not forget what is given to them. Sometimes the land takes a body because it must, because justice was not served, because a secret must remain buried, because the cost of peace is one soul. And when that happens, there's no trace, only questions. Was he taken? Did he choose to vanish? Was it punishment or mercy? The truth is, no one knows. And that's what makes it so haunting, because deep down, everyone fears it. To scream and have no one here, to beg and be met with stone, to be buried, but not dead. In medieval Scotland, they called it being claimed. Not by man, not by beast, but by the land itself. It's said that if you pass by a glen where someone disappeared long ago and you're very quiet, you can still feel it. A weight, like a breath held too long. And if you listen closely, closer than you should, you might hear a voice, not shouting, not weeping, just saying over and over, "I'm still here." But no one ever answers, because the body was never found. And without a body, there can be no goodbye, only stories, only silence, only the land, watching.